organisational change and all the elements that are in that. Over the last 3 weeks we've dealt with some very interesting issues, and we've got very good feedback on the discussions that we've had. We dealt with the strategic review and how to be sure that you get that right before you move into the organisational change. We dealt with the development plan, how you develop that plan to roll out your change and your change programme. And then we had communications last week with Andy Kelly, and dealing with all the areas around communications. Got a lot of information on that, and we may even have to return to that again because we had a lot of feedback on that. Today we're dealing with a very important issue, and one I suppose that caused a lot of angst for people, and that's the whole area of redundancies. And who we have here today to deal with this, we've got John Guinan. Again, you've met John before. John's been part of the panel all the time. We've got Martin Farrelly, and Martin's been with us before as well. And we've got our special guest today. We've got Frank Drunk here. Frank is barrister. Frank deals with IR and HR issues all of the time. Not just a barrister, he's, I suppose, late to the bar, Frank.
Late everywhere.
But a man who spent his lifetime in HR and general management, so he knows a thing or two about this. But just looking at that whole area of redundancies, you know, when we meet our clients and talk to them about it, it's one of the areas people freeze almost, because it's a minefield, really, isn't it?
It is a minefield, and I think the issue for the clients typically when you meet them is they're fearful because the risks of getting it wrong are so great. You know, from a variety of different levels, from a financial level, from a reputational level, from a business delivery level. Just so many different risks, and they do really get caught by it. So I think it's a very important issue to discuss this morning, and there's been lots of questions about it even before this morning.
It's one of the areas that causes the biggest upset and unrest in organisations, and is imbued with a lot of emotion. So for everybody concerned, it's a difficult time, particularly management side who are having to deal with it, and indeed all staff, those who will be made redundant and those who may not be made redundant. It has a huge impact on an organisation.
Even though we talk about the principles behind it and all the tasks you've got to do, but even the legalistic and the process of notification and all that causes a lot of difficulties for people. So that apart from the whole emotional side, there's the whole bureaucracy that's behind it, and it is the bureaucracy for organisations. So there's lots to talk about.
It's the fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
It is, and the sort of, we were flooded. We said last week we were going to talk about redundancies, and even we put it up on the site yesterday that we're going to talk about redundancies today. And in the meantime, we've been flooded with sort of queries, sort of things like the selection criteria. Now we want to cover that in some detail because that certainly exercises people. Then things like the skills matrix, you know, to the extent to which you can actually use that. We're looking at, you know, the consultative process. And the people are asking questions about that. Things like, for instance, fixed term contracts. People been on about a lot of 2 or 3 people came in about that, want to know what's the position about making people redundant if they're on fixed term contracts. And then things like the administration of it. People are actually, I find that to be a maze, which is very difficult to go through. But if I was to say straight up, Frank, because you're supposed to be the main man on this. The sort of things that people find difficult, or the mistakes they make, and you indeed, Martin, as well, because this is an area that you will do a lot of work, the sort of main mistakes that people make when they're going through this redundancy process.
Probably in my experience, like many other areas, it's a lack of preparation and a lack of just sitting down and organising what you're about and what you're trying to achieve. Redundancies, you know, in any organisation are not something that any company would like to enter into lightly. But if it becomes inevitable, and we've seen an increasing necessity, unfortunately, to use that great euphemism for companies to downsize or right size, which in effect, at the end of the day, means people are going to lose their jobs. It's important, to establish why you're going to do it, what it's about, and secondly, that you can justify what you're about.
Yeah, and we covered a fair bit of that in the communication of the last, but in the actual application of the thing itself, you know, in terms of the law, where people find themselves in trouble.
I think, you know, there are ways in which people can be exited from an organisation. There are some established ways, and there are ways that have become more prevalent in the recent past. So certainly traditionally, the last in, first out methodology would have been, you know, well deployed, and would be a sort of a deployment of choice, certainly in unionised environments. But the question we got in around the skills matrix is becoming an ever increasing way to actually select people in a redundancy situation. Because remember, what you're doing is a post is becoming redundant, the person just happens to occupy it, which is something that, you know, often gets lost in the mix. It's the job that becomes redundant, and then there is a person in that job who is affected by that decision. But where you have situations, for example, where there are multiple jobs with multiple job holders becoming fewer jobs, then you can use your skill matrix. You know, and John has been involved in this himself, where, you know, you conduct interviews then against agreed criteria which are fairly assessed, objectively assessed, and, you know, you can construct panels. Maybe, John, you talk about some of your work on that.
Well, it's just that, I mean, as it was the previous systems, I suppose, where whoever was last in was first out, but I mean, it has moved on to developing skills matrix, and against that, looking at people and giving them a chance to state their case in an interview situation, which wouldn't have been the pattern, say, 10 years ago, but is now very much. Yeah. But it is. I mean, and I suppose all comes back to whether this is going to be voluntary or compulsory as well.
Yeah. Just last, we have a question in on that, Frank. From a legal, I've seen people who have said, you know, the law says it's last in, first out. True?
No. There's no criteria in relation to last in, first out, and a good point made by Martin. The emphasis is on the job. If the job has been made redundant, there's the underlying obligation on the employer to behave like he must behave in all his dealings with the employee. He must act reasonably. Now, at the end of the day, in a redundancy scenario, bear in mind that, like everything else, redundancy is the termination of a contract of employment, and the contract of employment is the fundamental relationship between the employer and the employee. So the full title of redundancy is termination of employment by reason of redundancy. So if you're going to terminate somebody's employment, there's no lay down criteria as to how you're going to do it, but you are obliged to behave reasonably. And if you're going to end up, as you are liable to end up, to have all your actions questioned by an outside body such as the Employment Appeals Tribunal, there is a clear, besides your legal obligation, a sensible imperative that you behave reasonably and can defend whatever system you use. Now, was touched on a minute ago was a very good point. With the development of the situation in Ireland over the last 10, 20 years, and the less of the staff who are unionised, and the increase in white collar work, there is more of an obligation on HR people to be more comprehensive in the way they approach selection for redundancy. Because in the good old days, you contacted the union came in, you had the negotiation, and pretty much standard was last in, first out. And for all its pitfalls and whatever else, it was a very simple, transparent system. It was service and that was it. But now you must have greater regard to the nature and the level of the people who are being made redundant. The higher up the organisation you go, the less effective and the less applicable last in, first out is. It may still have a place in a large manufacturing environment whereby you have multiple jobs or hundreds of jobs at the same level, but that is an increasing feature of the Irish economy, and increasingly now one finds that there are more selective procedures, more matrix competencies, even performance are now being used as criteria.
It's interesting as Frank describes that, because certainly I would be working with somebody at the moment who would be a large organisation, unionised, but there are 3 different methodologies being used within the one organisation. Last in, first out has been used, the matrix and the selection criteria has been used, and then lastly there's a compulsory dimension. So all of those are in play at the one time.
Right.
So really the theory basically of needing to be reasonable excuse me, is the one that needs to be applied.
Yeah.
Well, it's an obligation, it's more than theory, it's an obligation. And John makes a very good point. Even though legally the imperative is with the employer to terminate anybody's employment by redundancy or anything else, de facto it has been established, it must be said, by dint of trade union activity, that before any employer now considers having compulsory redundancies, voluntary is now the accepted practice, not legally, but the accepted practice, that before you go the compulsory route, a voluntary package is generally, and this is becoming, even by the Employment Appeals Tribunal, are influenced by employers' actions, that did they offer a voluntary.
Okay, can I just cut to a couple of questions? There are a number of questions flying in here at the moment. How long does a staff member have to be in employment for redundancy payments apply?
104 weeks. They must have reckonable service of
104 weeks.
Yeah. That's it.
104 weeks. That's it. Okay, next one. We have a staff member absent for 2.5 years now. Do those years count in calculating the payment?
Absolutely. If they're absent, they're still in your employment. They're still in your employment until you terminate their employment. So all that time is reckonable service for the purposes of redundancy.
Yeah. One of the things, Peter, that's come up on the questions, I'm interested in Frank's view, is